She was sleeping when the soldiers came. A Cheyenne woman, her children beside her under buffalo robes, in a lodge at the bend of a shallow creek in southeastern Colorado Territory. Above the lodge, an American flag hung from a lodge pole. A white flag of surrender had been tied beneath it. Her people had been told, by the commander of the nearest United States fort, that these two flags, flown together, would keep her and her children safe. What do you do when the promises of a government are a lie? When the flag that is supposed to protect you is the flag flown by the men coming to tear down your family? This is the story of Sand Creek, and it is the story of what was done under that flag. Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. If you find yourself drawn to the stories that rarely make it into the standard histories, the ones that complicate the myth and honor the people who lived and died inside it, consider subscribing and consider leaving a comment at the end. What we're about to look at is difficult. It was difficult in 1864. It is difficult now. Your thoughts are welcome. To understand what happened at Sand Creek, you have to understand what the Great Plains looked like before the gold came. For generations before any American surveyor had drawn a line across it, the country between the North Platte River and the Arkansas River, a vast rolling sea of shortgrass prairie stretching from the foot of the Rocky Mountains eastward into what is now western Kansas, had belonged to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. Not belonged in the sense that European settlers understood ownership, with deeds and fences and surveyed corners. Belonged in the sense that their people had been born on it, had buried their dead in it, had followed the buffalo across it for as long as memory extended. The Cheyenne called themselves Tsitsistas, the people. The Arapaho called themselves Hinono-Eno. They were hunters, horsemen, and diplomats. They had their own political institutions, their own legal traditions, their own religions. The Cheyenne Nation was governed by a council of 44 chiefs, a body of mature men, one from each of the 10 bands, and a set of additional principal chiefs, whose authority rested on consensus and who were expected to look beyond the quarrels of any single season and think about the survival of their people a generation out. They were not savages. They were a civilization, and for most of the 19th century, the United States had at least publicly acknowledged that they were. In 1851, at a great council at Fort Laramie in what is now southeastern Wyoming, the United States and 7 native nations, the Cheyenne and Arapaho among them, had signed a treaty. By its terms, the government recognized that the Cheyenne and Arapaho held an enormous territory, most of eastern Colorado, a piece of southern Wyoming, a strip of western Nebraska, the westernmost portion of Kansas. It was, on paper, their country. It had been for a very long time, and the Treaty of Fort Laramie said so in the language of treaties and statutes. The chiefs who signed it believed their children would live there. 7 years later, in the autumn of 1858, a prospector named William Greenberry Russell found gold in the gravel of the Rocky Mountains at the foot of what would become the city of Denver. The Pikes Peak gold rush that followed brought more than 100,000 people west over the next 2 years. Nearly all of them crossed Cheyenne and Arapaho land to get there. They camped on it, hunted on it, cut timber on it, built roads across it. They did not leave. The territorial officials of the newly organized Colorado Territory pressured Washington to redraw the map. And in February of 1861, under a new treaty signed at Fort Wise along the Arkansas River, a small handful of Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs, among them Black Kettle and White Antelope for the Cheyenne, Little Raven and Left Hand for the Arapaho, were induced to put their marks on a document that reduced the territory guaranteed to them in 1851 by more than 90%, a reservation less than 1/13 the size of what had been theirs, a narrow triangle between the Arkansas River and a shallow watercourse called Big Sandy Creek. Most of the Cheyenne Nation did not accept it. The Council of 44, the actual governing authority of the Cheyenne people, had never approved the treaty. Many of the chiefs who signed later said they had not fully understood what they were signing, that they had been presented with the paper at the end of a long series of gifts and promises, and told this was the way forward. The Cheyenne warriors denounced the signing chiefs. Some even threatened them with death. The Dog Soldiers, a militant warrior society that had by the 1830s become something closer to a separate band, drawing younger men from across the Cheyenne Nation and Lakota allies, simply refused to leave the buffalo country. They kept hunting where they had always hunted, along the Smoky Hill and Republican rivers, and became more and more openly hostile to the whites pouring across their lands. This is the ground on which the Sand Creek Massacre grew, a treaty nobody on either side fully trusted, a reservation carved out of someone else's promises, a generation of younger Cheyenne men who had watched the older chiefs sign away their country and had decided the older chiefs were wrong. By the spring of 1864, the Civil War was in its fourth bloody year, and the United States Army had almost no troops to spare for the plains. Stage lines were being attacked along the Platte Road. Ranches were being burned. On the 11th of June, a family named Hungate, Nathan Hungate, his wife Ellen, and their two small daughters, were murdered on their ranch about 30 miles southeast of Denver, almost certainly by a raiding party of Arapaho. Their mutilated bodies were carted into Denver and publicly displayed. What happened next mattered enormously for the story that follows, because after the Hungate murders, the political climate in Colorado Territory began to move towards something very dark, and it moved very fast. John Evans, the territorial governor, was an ambitious man who wanted Colorado admitted to the Union as a state. Statehood required population, stability, and a demonstration that the new territory could manage its own affairs. It did not help his political ambitions for the territory to be seen as a war zone where ranchers were being scalped on their doorsteps. And so, in late June of 1864, Evans issued a proclamation. It told all friendly Cheyenne and Arapaho to come to certain designated forts. The Cheyenne to Fort Lyon on the Arkansas, the Arapaho further north, where they would be under the protection of the United States Army and would be fed. Any Indians found off those designated places of safety would be considered hostile and subject to attack. The proclamation sounded humane. It was not, because at the same moment Evans was publicly inviting peaceful bands to come in for protection, he was also writing privately to the War Department in Washington, asking for authority to raise a new regiment, a short-term volunteer force of 100-day men, for the specific purpose of making war on the tribes of the plains. Authorization came through in August. Colonel John Milton Chivington, a Methodist minister turned Civil War officer, commander of the Military District of Colorado, would be the man overseeing the new regiment. Its official designation was the 3rd Regiment of Colorado Cavalry. The men who signed up for it would serve for 100 days, and in that single fact lies the entire logic of what happened next. A 100-day regiment is not a military unit, it is a political instrument. The men of the 3rd Colorado had volunteered in a wave of public anger after the Hungate murders, under the assurance that they would get to fight Indians. By the end of November 1864, their enlistments were almost up. They had not fought anyone. In Denver, in the newspapers, in the saloons, they had already been given a mocking nickname, the Bloodless Third. And their colonel, Chivington, who had seen his own political career stalling, who had spent 2 years telling anyone who would listen that the only solution to the Plains tribes was extermination, was running out of time to use them. At the end of September, in a council held at Camp Weld, just outside Denver, Governor Evans and Colonel Chivington had met face to face with Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs. Black Kettle was there. So was White Antelope, an old man in his 70s who had been to Washington and shaken President Lincoln's hand. So was Bull Bear. So was the Arapaho chief Niwot, known in English as Left Hand. They had come under military escort brought in by Major Edward Wynkoop, the commander of Fort Lyon, a young officer who had talked with the chiefs, trusted them, and become convinced that peace was possible. At the Camp Weld Council, the chiefs asked what they should do. The messages they got back were tangled and, in some passages, openly menacing. Evans told them that peace would have to be made with the soldiers, not with him. Chivington told them that if they sought peace, they should go to Fort Lyon and place themselves under Major Wynkoop's protection. Black Kettle believed him. That belief would kill most of his people. It is very important, before we go further, to understand who Black Kettle actually was. He was not a war chief. He was not even a particularly young man. He was a peace chief of the Council of 44, an office that, by Cheyenne tradition, required him to set aside personal grievance and personal violence, and to work always for accommodation. He had signed the hated Treaty of Fort Wise in 1861. He had been condemned for it by younger warriors, and yet he had kept working year after year to find some way for his people to survive inside the American system. He was, by the judgment of almost every historian who has written about him, exactly the sort of man whom a rational government would have wanted to protect. And he was, in late November of 1864, encamped with roughly 750 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, at a bend in Big Sandy Creek, about 40 miles north of Fort Lyon, flying an American flag above his lodge. He had been told he was safe. He was not. To understand how Black Kettle ended up at Sand Creek, believing himself protected, you have to understand the terrible game that was being played over his head in the weeks before the attack. In early September of 1864, Major Edward Wynkoop had received a letter from Black Kettle through an intermediary, a half-Cheyenne, half-white man named George Bent, the son of the trader William Bent, and a Cheyenne woman who was living in Black Kettle's camp and would, by the end of November, survive the massacre himself. The letter proposed peace. It offered an exchange of prisoners. Wynkoop, a young major still finding his footing in his command at Fort Lyon, decided to take the risk of going out alone to meet them. He rode with a small detachment into the Smoky Hill country and sat down in a Cheyenne camp surrounded by warriors and talked. He came back alive. He came back changed. He had gone believing, as most of the officers around him believed, that the Cheyenne were a uniform hostile force that had to be beaten before they would listen. He left convinced that the chiefs he had met wanted peace as badly as he did, and that there was a deal to be made. Wynkoop escorted Black Kettle and the other chiefs to Denver for the Camp Weld Council on the 28th of September. He had reason to believe he was doing his job, bringing hostile parties to the negotiating table, acting as a soldier should act. He did not yet understand that his superiors in Denver did not actually want a negotiated peace. They wanted a war, a short one, short enough to finish before the 3rd Colorado's enlistments ran out. After Camp Weld, Wynkoop brought the chiefs back toward Fort Lyon and told them, in good faith, that they should settle their people on Big Sandy Creek, within a day's ride of the fort, where he could keep an eye on them and where they would be clearly identifiable as friendly. Black Kettle did exactly that. His band, joined by some Arapahos under Chief Niwot, came in. They surrendered some weapons. They accepted rations when rations were offered. They did what the United States government had told them to do. Then, on the 5th of November, Wynkoop was removed from command at Fort Lyon. This is one of the pivots on which the entire story turns. Wynkoop was too soft on the Cheyenne, in Chivington's judgment. He had been working around Chivington rather than through him. Chivington complained to his superior, General Samuel Curtis, and Wynkoop was reassigned. His replacement was a Major Scott Anthony, a different kind of officer entirely. Anthony shared Chivington's view that the Indian problem in Colorado was, at root, a problem that needed to be solved by force. When he arrived at Fort Lyon, he cut off rations to some of the Cheyenne who had come in under Wynkoop's promises. He told them they would have to move further away from the fort to Big Sandy Creek. He gave assurances that they would be safe there. He did not, at the moment he gave those assurances, know for a certainty what Chivington was planning. But within days, he would. Black Kettle believed Anthony. He moved his people to the bend at Sand Creek. He settled them in for the winter. Meanwhile, in Denver, Colonel Chivington was assembling a column. 700 men of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, the bloodless 3rd, whose 100-day enlistments were ticking toward expiration, along with detachments of the 1st Colorado Cavalry and a small company of the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Infantry. 4 mountain howitzers. A long, quiet march south across the frozen plains, conducted in what contemporary accounts describe as great secrecy. No one along the route was to send word ahead. Riders who might carry warnings were detained. When the column reached Fort Lyon on the 28th of November, Chivington posted guards around the fort. Officers who were known to be friendly to the Cheyenne were placed effectively under house arrest. Captain Silas Soule watched it happen. He was 26 years old, Massachusetts-born, an abolitionist who had spent his youth in Kansas, fighting to keep slavery out of the territory. He had ridden with John Brown's people. He had made his peace with violence in certain causes. But when Chivington briefed the officers at Fort Lyon on the plan, a dawn attack on Black Kettle's encampment with no quarter, Soule refused. He said so openly. "Any man that would take part in the murders, knowing the circumstances as we do," Soule told his fellow officers, "is a low-lived, cowardly son of a bitch." Lieutenant Joseph Kramer said much the same. Lieutenant James Connor said much the same. They pointed out that these were the very people the United States had promised to protect. They pointed out that the camp contained almost no warriors because most of the young men were out on a buffalo hunt. They pointed out that this was not a battle. It was a massacre dressed in uniform. Chivington threatened to hang Soule for inciting mutiny. He told the rest of the dissenting officers that if they did not like his orders, they could resign their commissions. The orders stood. On the night of November 28th, the column rode out of Fort Lyon. They rode through the night. With them, serving as guide, was a man whose presence in this story is one of its stranger ironies. James Beckwourth, the African-American mountain man, a former fur trapper who had lived for decades among the Crow and was, by this point, in his mid-60s. Beckwourth would later testify about what he had seen. He would describe being conscripted essentially into the column, old, ill, cold, riding at the front of a force he did not want to lead where it was going. The column traveled about 40 miles in the dark. The men drank from flasks as they rode, against the cold, against their nerves, against whatever else was working on them. They camped briefly in the early hours of the morning. They did not sleep much. Some of them, according to later testimony, were already drunk when they got back in the saddle. At dawn, on the 29th of November, 1864, they came over a low rise and saw the village. It was laid out along a long, shallow bend of the creek, the lodges pale in the gray light, wisps of smoke from banked fires rising straight up in the cold, still air. A pony herd grazed to the north. There was no picket line. There were no sentries. Nobody was expecting them. Black Kettle was still asleep in his lodge. The American flag was still flying from its lodgepole. The white flag was there too. Chivington deployed his force. He sent detachments to cut off the pony herd, take the horses, take the ability of the village to flee. He deployed his artillery. The howitzers were brought up on a rise overlooking the camp. He positioned his cavalry to approach from the south and southwest. The plan was simple. Shoot everything that moves, burn what is left. At around 6:30 in the morning, the first shots were fired. Inside the lodges, the first sounds that many people heard were not gunfire, but something else. A young Cheyenne warrior named Little Bear, who had gotten up very early that morning to retrieve a horse, had looked south toward the Fort Lyon Trail from a rise just above the camp and had seen, in the first gray light, what he later described as a long black line on the horizon. Soldiers, hundreds of them. He had sprinted back to the camp to spread the warning. People were only just beginning to stir. Some came out of their lodges to look. Others pulled robes over their heads and tried to understand what was happening. Black Kettle understood instantly what was coming. He ran out of his lodge. He lifted the American flag and the white flag of surrender higher on the lodgepole. He began to call out, in the loudest voice he could manage, that his people were friendly, that they should not be afraid, that the soldiers would see the flags and stop. He had been told by the commander of Fort Lyon that these flags would protect him. He was still, even then, trying to make the system work. The soldiers saw the flags. They opened fire anyway. Among the first to die was White Antelope. The old chief, 75 years old, who had been to Washington and met Lincoln, who had fought for accommodation his entire life, walked out from his lodge, unarmed, and stood in the middle of the creek bed in the open. According to the accounts of survivors and later witnesses, he crossed his arms over his chest, chanted his death song, and waited. The song, as it has been remembered by the Cheyenne, went, "Nothing lives long, only the earth and the mountains." He was cut down where he stood. Soldiers would later mutilate his body in ways we will describe honestly but briefly. They scalped him, cut off his ears, cut off his nose, and, according to the sworn congressional testimony of multiple witnesses, cut off his testicles, which one soldier carried off as a tobacco pouch. This is what American soldiers in uniform did to the body of a 75-year-old peace chief who had just walked out unarmed under the flag of the United States. The camp disintegrated into chaos. Women grabbed their children and ran. Some ran upstream along the creek bed, where the banks were higher and offered some cover. Some ran downstream. Some simply ran in whatever direction was away from the soldiers. The dry bed of Sand Creek became a killing channel. As people scrambled through the sand, the soldiers on horseback rode them down. Howitzer shells began to burst overhead and among the fleeing figures. Cheyenne, warrior Morning Star, who survived, would later say that most of the Indian dead were killed by cannon fire, especially from the guns firing from the south bank down at the people trying to escape up the creek. Among those who fled upstream was George Bent, the half-Cheyenne, half-white man who had carried word of Black Kettle's peace offer to Wynkoop months before. Bent would write later, in letters to the historian George Hyde, that survive and remain one of the most important primary sources for what happened that day, that he ran with a group of other survivors up the creek. They dug holes in the sand beneath the high banks. They huddled there. Soldiers came up and fired down into the holes. Some were killed where they hid. Others, including Bent, survived by some combination of luck, cover, and the sheer confusion of the soldiers. Bent was wounded. Somehow, he lived. Captain Silas Soule, at the head of Company D of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, gave the order that has preserved his name in the history of this country. He told his men to hold their fire. They did. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, commanding Company K, gave the same order. His men held their fire, too. Roughly 100 soldiers, out of the 700 in the field that morning, refused to participate in the killing. They sat on their horses and watched. They would later testify at personal cost, so severe that one of them would be murdered for it, to what they had seen. What they had seen had, by mid-morning, turned from battle into something for which the English language does not have a clean word. The fighting, such as it was essentially over within the first hour. The Cheyenne warriors in the camp, the few who were there, the old men and the very young, the ones who had not been out hunting, had either been killed or had been driven out onto the prairie. Most of the people left in the killing zone were women, children, and the elderly. The soldiers stayed for 8 hours. What happened during those 8 hours, and in the 2 days that followed, is the heart of this story. It is why the Sand Creek Massacre is not remembered as a battle, and why the men who tried to remember it as one, beginning with the man who gave the order, were condemned by their own government. Before we go into what the soldiers did in those hours, we need to stop for a moment and acknowledge something important. The sources for what follows include sworn congressional testimony from multiple American officers and soldiers who were present. They include the accounts of the survivors, including George Bent's letters. They include the contemporaneous letters of Silas Soule and Joseph Kramer, which were written within weeks of the massacre, and which disappeared for more than a century before being rediscovered in a family collection in Denver in the year 2000. Those Soule and Kramer letters are, by the judgment of the historians who have examined them, among the most damning eyewitness accounts of an American military atrocity that exist in the historical record. They describe what 100 men who refused to fire saw 600 other men, acting under the orders of their colonel, do. They describe, in brief, the deliberate killing of surrendering women, the deliberate killing of infants, the systematic mutilation of the dead, the hours spent afterward wandering the field, collecting body parts to take home, the 2 days of continued depredations during which the surviving soldiers picked through the wreckage of the village. Act 1 of this story ends with the fighting still going on. The cold November sun has risen clear of the horizon. The howitzers are still firing. Women are still running up the creek bed, trying to get their children to the high banks. 100 American soldiers are sitting on their horses, refusing. 600 others are killing. And in Denver, 100 miles away, the newspapers were already preparing to celebrate a great victory. But before we move into that killing, we need to spend a little more time with the people in the village. Because one of the things that history has been bad at for 160 years is remembering that the people who died at Sand Creek were not a number. They were not a statistic. They were individuals. And what was taken from them was not an abstraction. There were, by the best surviving counts, roughly 750 people in the encampment. They were split between 2 groups. Most of them were Cheyenne, members of several bands, though the largest was Black Kettle's own band, the Wutapu. The Hevhaitanyu, under the chiefs Yellow Wolf and Big Man, were there. The Oivimana, under War Bonnet, were there. The Hisiomatanio, the Ridgemen, under White Antelope. Another group, Chief One-Eye's band, was there. The smaller Arapaho presence was about 10 lodges, perhaps 50 or 60 people, under Chief Niwot, Left Hand, who had signed the Fort Wise Treaty back in 1861 and had kept trying to find a path to peace ever since. The village was arranged in the traditional way, The lodges, set up in a rough curve along the northern bend of the dry creek bed, sheltered from the prevailing winds by the low bluffs to the north and west. Inside each lodge, extended families slept on beds of buffalo robes laid over dried grass and willow mats. Cooking fires had been banked for the night with ash. The pony herd grazed out on the prairie to the north, maybe 600 or 700 animals altogether, tended loosely by young boys who slept with their blankets near the herd. It was cold, but not bitterly so. The temperature had been sliding down toward freezing for several days, and there was no snow on the ground, but the creek itself was running only in trickles between sheets of ice. The air in the hour before dawn was still and very clear. You could see a long way across the plains, even in the dark. Of the 750 people in that camp, somewhere between 60 and 75 were adult male warriors. Everyone else was a woman, a child, an elder, or a young boy not yet of fighting age. This is the detail that matters most, and that every honest contemporary witness confirmed. The warriors of Black Kettle's band had not run away. They had gone east days before, on a buffalo hunt. They were miles from Sand Creek when the soldiers came. They were doing what a plains people did in the late autumn, preparing the stored meat that would see their families through the winter. The men who would have fought in any meaningful way, the ones who could have met the 3rd Colorado Cavalry on something like equal terms, were not there. And by the time those warriors heard the news and rode back, it would be far too late. They would find the wreckage. The people who were in the lodges that morning, the ones who died, were specific people with specific names embedded in specific families. White Antelope was there, of course, the old peace chief who had been to Washington the previous year and had shaken Lincoln's hand and had received a peace medal which he still wore that morning when he walked out unarmed to be killed. One Eye Ochinee was there, a Cheyenne peace chief who had actually escaped from the camp in the opening minutes of the attack, and then, seeing what was happening to his people, deliberately turned around and rode back into the killing to die with them. His granddaughter, Mary Prowers Hudnall, would later tell that story in her own words, that her grandfather had chosen to return. Yellow Wolf, Big Man, War Bonnet, Spotted Crow, Bear Robe, all members of the Cheyenne Council of 44, all of the men who had spent their adult lives trying to keep their people alive inside a catastrophe they had not caused. All of them died that day. There were mothers, there were infants still nursing, there were grandmothers, there were teenage girls, there were boys who had never held anything bigger than a bow meant for squirrels. There was a 3-year-old who would, in the course of the morning, be used for target practice by 3 soldiers in succession, an episode that Major Anthony himself, who participated in the attack, later described in sworn testimony to the New York Tribune. The first 2 soldiers missed. The third did not. Among the people in the camp were several who would survive and whose testimony, gathered over the following decades, has given us most of what we know about what happened. George Bent, the half-white, half-Cheyenne son of the trader William Bent, was there. He was in his mid-20s. His brother Charlie Bent was there. A young Cheyenne warrior named Morning Star was there. Little Bear was there. A handful of others. Their accounts do not always match. Memory does not work that way, especially the memory of trauma. But the broad outlines on which they all agree are consistent with the testimony of the American officers who refused to fire and consistent with the findings of 3 separate investigations that Congress and the Army would conduct over the following year. The last thing worth saying before we go back to the killing is this. The people in Black Kettle's camp were not naive. They knew the risk they were running by trusting the white government. The Cheyenne had seen enough American treachery over the preceding decade to have every reason for skepticism. Lean Bear, one of their own chiefs, had been murdered by soldiers 6 months earlier on the plains of Kansas while wearing his Lincoln Peace Medal and waving a paper signed by the president declaring his peaceful intent. That memory was fresh. And yet Black Kettle and White Antelope and One Eye and Left Hand and all the others had made a judgment. They had judged that their people, especially the women and children, had no chance of surviving a war with the United States. They had decided to trust, one more time, the promises of a government that had broken every promise it had ever made to them. It was not a stupid bet. It was the only bet that gave the old, the young, and the sick any chance at all of living through the next winter. It was a bet made by peace chiefs whose entire job, under Cheyenne tradition, was to think about their children's children. It would cost nearly all of them their lives. Now we go back into the creek bed. The first wave of Chivington's attack had swept through the village in a matter of minutes. The pony herd had been cut off and driven away to the north, so that any Cheyenne or Arapaho who wanted to flee would have to do so on foot. The howitzers were firing from the rise south of the camp. The cavalry was riding through the lodges, and in and around them, firing on anyone they saw. Within maybe half an hour, the camp itself, the standing lodges, the cooking fires, the ordinary geography of a people's home, was no longer really the site of the battle. The fighting, if it could be called that, had moved up the dry bed of Sand Creek. Hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women and children, had fled in that direction. The banks of the creek, higher upstream than they were at the camp itself, offered the only cover on the open plains. People began to dig into the sand beneath the overhanging banks with their hands. They made small pits, shallow trenches. They pushed children into these holes and covered them with sand and their own bodies. Some of the older women took the lead in organizing the small pockets of survival. Others tried to keep moving upstream, looking for anything that looked more defensible. Chivington's soldiers followed. They rode up the banks. They dismounted where they needed to. They fired down into the sand pits. The howitzers on the higher ground kept up their fire, shells bursting among the exposed groups moving up the creek bed. What follows in this section is difficult. It is difficult because it is sworn congressional testimony from American officers, and because it has been corroborated by survivor accounts, by the Soule and Kramer letters, and by the findings of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. We will describe it briefly and honestly. We will not dwell on it because dwelling on atrocity serves no good purpose. But we will not sanitize it either, because sanitizing what happened at Sand Creek is exactly the mistake that American public memory has made for most of the century and a half since. John S. Smith was an interpreter who had been present in the camp that morning. His son, whose mother was Cheyenne, was among the people in the village. Smith testified before Congress the following spring. He described bodies cut into pieces, worse mutilated than any he had ever seen. Women cut to pieces with knives, children 2 and 3 months old, all ages. He was asked who had done it. He answered, "United States troops." Robert Bent, half Cheyenne, half white, the brother of George Bent, serving as an unwilling guide for Chivington that morning, would later tell the New York Tribune what he had seen. He described a woman lying on the bank of the creek, her leg broken, trying to defend herself. A soldier approached with a drawn saber. She raised her arm. He struck, breaking it. She rolled over and raised the other arm. He struck, breaking that one too, and walked away without killing her. Robert Bent described a woman cut open, her unborn child lying on the ground beside her. Major Scott Anthony, who was not a reluctant witness, who had actually commanded part of the attack, described in his own later testimony the death of a child. The child was maybe 3 years old. Its people had already fled and were some distance upstream. The little boy, naked, was walking through the sand, trying to catch up. Anthony saw a soldier dismount from his horse about 75 yards off, kneel, raise his rifle, and fire at the child. He missed. Another soldier tried. He missed too. A third soldier said, in Anthony's account, "Let me try the little so-and-so," dismounted, knelt, fired, and hit the child. The boy dropped. Lieutenant James Cannon, in his own statement entered into the congressional record, described the mutilation of the dead. He said that men, women, and children's private parts had been cut out. He said he had heard one soldier boast about cutting a woman's genitals out and putting them on a stick for display. He said he had heard about infants being thrown into the feed boxes of supply wagons and carried some distance before being dumped onto the ground to die. He said he had heard of men who had stretched the genitals of Cheyenne women across their saddlebows. He said he had seen some of them over soldiers' hats. This is in the official record of the United States Congress. It was sworn to under oath by American soldiers who had been present. Not one of the horrors listed in that congressional record was denied by the men who committed them. They were, in fact, proud of them. Over the weeks that followed, the returning soldiers of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry displayed body parts taken from Sand Creek in the saloons of Denver and on the stage of Denver's Apollo Theater to applauding audiences. The killing lasted about 8 hours. Toward the end of it, groups of survivors who had held out in the sand pits began, in the late afternoon as the soldiers began to withdraw, to work their way further up the creek in 2s and 3s. When full darkness came, the survivors, many of them wounded, most of them without shoes, many of them separated from their families, all of them having watched members of their families be killed or mutilated only hours before, began to crawl out of their holes. They moved together in small groups across the frozen ground. They did not have food, they did not have water, they did not have blankets. George Bent, in his later account, described the terrible cold of that first night. People freezing to death who had survived the bullets because they had nothing to cover them. Over the course of the next day, the survivors of Sand Creek began to work their way northeast toward the headwaters of the Smoky Hill River, where another Cheyenne camp existed. It was a journey of approximately 50 miles on foot in late November with no supplies. Some of them did not make it. Those who did were taken in by their relatives on the Smoky Hill, fed, warmed, and allowed to collapse. Back at Sand Creek, meanwhile, Chivington's men spent 2 additional days at the scene. They plundered what remained of the lodges. They caught and kept the ponies that had not been killed. They returned to the bodies of the dead. Returned, meaning they went back to corpses, many of which were already dead from the day before, and continued to mutilate them, cutting off parts they wanted as trophies. They killed such of the wounded as they could find. According to later congressional testimony, at least 3 Cheyenne survivors who had remained hidden in the village, including George Bent's brother Charlie, along with 2 Cheyenne women, were captured alive during this cleanup and at various points either spared or transferred into the custody of William Bent. Larry McMurtry, writing about the massacre generations later, would note that the son of Chivington's own scout, John Smith, a boy whose mother was Cheyenne, was in the camp, survived the initial attack, and was then, in McMurtry's account, executed afterward. On December 1st, the column began its march back to Fort Lyon, and from there back to Denver. They carried with them the scalps and body parts they had collected. They carried with them a story. And the story, as told in Denver in the first days of December 1864, was the story of a great victory against a hostile foe. Chivington sent an initial dispatch to his superiors claiming he had fought a battle against a camp of 900 Cheyenne warriors, a number he had simply invented, and had killed 500 or 600 of them. He praised the conduct of his men. He spoke of a long march through snow. He wrote, in the official military language of triumph, as if Sand Creek had been Shiloh or Gettysburg. The soldiers marched back into Denver on December 22nd to a hero's welcome. The Rocky Mountain News, a paper that had been beating the drum for war against the Plains tribes for 2 years, ran headlines declaring a great victory and describing the 3rd Colorado as having washed the stain of their nickname forever from their shoulders. They were no longer the bloodless 3rd. They were now, in the papers and the saloons, the Bloody 3rd. It was meant as a compliment. The Apollo Theater in Denver, which had been programmed with standard 19th century vaudeville entertainment that week, added a feature during the intermissions, the display of Cheyenne scalps and body parts taken at Sand Creek. The audience applauded. The hats and saddles of the returning soldiers were decorated with Cheyenne genitalia, male and female, in some cases stretched across their gear as if it were leather. Fingers and ears were sliced off bodies for the silver and brass rings the victims had been wearing. Some of this ornamentation stayed on public display for months. And in the middle of this celebration, Silas Soule and Joseph Kramer sat down to write letters. The letters are dated mid-December of 1864, within 2 weeks of the massacre. They were written to Edward Wynkoop, who by then had been reassigned and was at a different post. They describe in plain and sometimes almost numb language what Soule and Kramer had seen: the 100 men who refused to fire, the 8 hours of killing, the specific mutilations, the specific killings of specific women and children. Silas Soule's letter described a baby being picked up by the scalp, the skin of the skull stripped off and the body tossed aside. It described a woman whose entire left side of the face had been shot away, sitting up against a bank with her child in her lap, still alive when Soule approached. It described soldiers taking bets on whether they could hit a running child. It described Chivington himself, after the fighting, boasting of what had been done. Soule wrote to Wynkoop, "I refused to fire and swore that none but a coward would." He wrote, "I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized." He wrote his letters in the knowledge that they would be used. He knew he was putting his life on the line. He wrote them anyway. These letters would be lost to history for 136 years. They would resurface in Denver in the year 2000, found in the papers of a private family collection, and when they were authenticated and published, they became, along with the sworn congressional testimony, the foundational eyewitness record of what happened at Sand Creek from the side of the American officers who refused to participate. But in December of 1864, the letters were private. Soule had sent them to a man he trusted. What Soule did publicly over the following weeks was more dangerous. He talked. He talked to anyone who would listen. He said openly in Denver that what had happened at Sand Creek had been a massacre of peaceful, unarmed women and children. He said it in a city where his commanding officer had just been celebrated as a hero. He said it in bars where the body parts of the victims were still on display. He kept saying it. Within weeks, word of what Soule and Kramer were saying reached Washington. It reached General Samuel Curtis, commanding the Department of Kansas, who began to ask questions of his own. It reached Army Inspector General James Connor, a different officer, not the Lieutenant Connor who had refused orders at Fort Lyon, who took a long statement from Soule and filed his own damning report up the chain of command. It reached Congress. In the weeks that followed, 3 separate investigations were opened. A military commission convened in Denver, Another inquiry under the Army's own auspices, and most importantly, a full hearing by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War of the United States Congress, the same body that had investigated Union military failures throughout the Civil War. The Joint Committee was chaired by Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, one of the most formidable figures in Washington. The Joint Committee's hearings opened in March of 1865. Silas Soule was summoned to Denver to testify before the Military Commission. He came. He told what he had seen in specific detail, on the record, in public, in a city full of men who hated him for it. He gave his testimony on the 14th of March. Weeks later, on the afternoon of April 23, 1865, Soule was on patrol duty in Denver when he was approached by a man named Charles Squires, a private who had served under Chivington at Sand Creek. Squires shot Silas Soule in the face, in the street, and fled the territory. Soule died within hours. He was 26 years old. He had been married for less than 2 weeks. The murderer escaped to New Mexico. Another officer, Lieutenant James Cannon, whose own testimony we quoted earlier, tracked Squires down and brought him back to Denver to face trial. Before the trial could begin, Squires escaped from custody and was never seen again. Many people believed, then and later, that Chivington himself had arranged both the killing and the escape. No proof of Chivington's direct involvement has ever surfaced. What is clear is that the one American officer who had, at greatest personal risk, provided the most complete public testimony to what Chivington had done was assassinated for it by a man who had served under Chivington who was never punished. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War took Chivington's own testimony on the 26th of April, 3 days after Soule's murder. Chivington testified that he had attacked a village of hostile Cheyenne warriors, that he had killed between 500 and 600 of them, that few of them had been women or children, that the engagement had been a legitimate battle. He was contradicted in specific detail by witness after witness who followed him. Soldiers who had been there, officers who had been there, traders who had been in the camp that morning. The committee's findings, published in the spring of 1865, used some of the strongest language that any American congressional body has ever used against one of its own commanders. The committee wrote, "As to Colonel Chivington, your committee can hardly find fitting terms to describe his conduct, wearing the uniform of the United States, which should be the emblem of justice and humanity, holding the important position of commander of a military district, and therefore having the honor of the government. To that extent in his keeping, he deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre which would have disgraced the veriest savage among those who were the victims of his cruelty." Note the phrase, veriest savage. The Committee of the United States Congress, writing in the official language of its formal investigation, used the word savage, the word that the American press had used for years about the Plains tribes, and applied it to Colonel Chivington. They went on. Having full knowledge of their friendly character, having himself been instrumental to some extent in placing them in their position of fancied security, he took advantage of their inapprehension and defenseless condition to gratify the worst passions that ever cursed the heart of man. The committee recommended that prompt and energetic measures be taken to remove from office those responsible and to punish those guilty of what it called brutal and cowardly acts. No such punishment ever came. Chivington had resigned his Army commission in February of 1865, before the Joint Committee issued its report. Because he was no longer in the Army, no court-martial could reach him. The general amnesty at the end of the Civil War, extended to essentially all Union officers for actions taken during the war, covered him. Criminal charges under civilian law were not brought. The worst punishment, that John Chivington ever suffered for planning and executing an atrocity that multiple congressional findings described as a massacre of the defenseless was that his political career was destroyed. He never held office. He drifted. He tried business, failed at it, tried farming, failed at it, married his own son's widow, was sued for divorce, and lived the rest of his life under the shadow of Sand Creek, always claiming that his actions had been right. He said it again on his deathbed. He died in Denver in 1894 at the age of 73 of cancer. He is buried at Fairmount Cemetery. His funeral was held at Trinity Methodist Church. That is the end of Act Two. The killing is over. The denunciations are public. The man who ordered the killings has escaped formal punishment, though he has not escaped public disgrace. But this story does not end there, because what happened at Sand Creek rippled outward through the plains, through American Indian policy, through the memory of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, and through the history of this country in ways that have not finished unfolding even now. Before we move into the consequences that followed, we need to spend more time in the specific human detail of what happened, because the specificity matters. Historians who have done the long and painful work of reading through the congressional testimony, Stan Hoig, Gregory Michno, Jerome Green, more recently Ari Kellman, have noted that the most powerful corrective against the old myth of Sand Creek as a battle is simply to read at length what the American soldiers who were there said about what they saw, not what the Cheyenne said, not what later historians concluded, what the men in blue uniforms told their own government under oath. Lieutenant James Connor, not to be confused with the Inspector General of the same last name, had refused to take part in the attack. He gave his own statement, which was filed with Wincoup's reports and entered into the War of the Rebellion official records. Connor said flatly that he had seen the bodies of men, women, and children mutilated in the worst manner. He said that he saw a soldier display, publicly, what he called a white man's privates, meaning the soldier had cut genitals off a corpse and was showing them around the camp. Connor said he had heard of children with their brains beaten out by the butts of muskets. He had heard of women whose pregnant bodies had been cut open to see what was inside. He had seen none of these things stopped. He had seen, in his own phrasing, nothing done by any officer to restrain the men who did them. Major Edward Wincoup, the officer who had been removed from command at Fort Lyon weeks before the attack, had not been present for the killing. That was exactly what Chivington had engineered. But when the news reached him, Wincoup turned himself into something close to a full-time investigator. He took statements, he gathered evidence, he corresponded with officers, he pushed for the cases to be heard. He was, along with Soule and Kramer, the reason this story did not die. He paid a professional price for it. His career in the Army suffered. He was marginalized by the elements within the military that wanted Sand Creek to be forgotten. But he did not stop talking. Kit Carson, of all people, weighed in. Carson was an old mountain man by 1864, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a man who had himself fought the Navajo in a brutal campaign the year before that he would spend the rest of his life trying to make peace with. Carson was not soft on native war makers. He had killed them himself. But when Carson heard what had happened at Sand Creek, he was reported to have said, in the salty frontier language of his generation, that it made him sick. In a conversation later recorded by Colonel James Rustling, Carson called Chivington a dog and called his men dirty hounds. He said that they had shot down squaws and blown the brains out of innocent children. He asked, with what seems to have been genuine anguish in the retelling, whether we called such soldiers Christians and called Indians savages, and what Carson's Heavenly Father would think of that. He said he had fought hostile Indians as hard as any man ever did, but that he had never drawn a bead on a woman or a baby, and that he despised any man who would. That was Kit Carson talking, the most famous Indian fighter in the American imagination, appalled by what had been done to non-combatants by men wearing the uniform of his own government. And yet, for weeks after the return to Denver, the public reaction in Colorado Territory was very different. The Rocky Mountain News, under an editor named William Byers, who had been one of the loudest voices agitating for war against the Plains tribes, ran triumphant coverage. The newspaper described the Third Colorado's campaign as a great military success, defended Chivington personally, and for weeks denounced any officer or soldier who suggested otherwise as a coward or a traitor. The news was, in its way, a perfect mirror of the broader politics of settler Colorado in 1864. Most of the white population of the territory believed, or wanted to believe, that Sand Creek had been a battle against a dangerous enemy. Most of them were happy to have body parts displayed in their taverns and theaters. Most of them cheered the returning soldiers. A mounted cavalry parade through the streets of Denver on December 22nd, with Cheyenne scalps on display and soldiers wearing looted articles from the village, drew enthusiastic crowds. It took weeks, and in some cases months, for the counter-narrative to gain traction. It took the courage of Silas Soule. It took the letters of Kramer. It took the testimony of the officers who had refused orders. It took an investigation by General Curtis, and then the military commission in Denver, and then, ultimately, the congressional inquiry in Washington. And even as the truth was coming out, even as the full record of what had been done was being sworn to in sober rooms before officers and congressmen, the newspapers of Denver kept publishing rebuttals. Chivington was defended in the Colorado press right up through his congressional testimony in April 1865. Some of his Denver admirers never stopped defending him. His own obituary in 1894 in the Denver Republican described his long life as having been honorably spent. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about Sand Creek. It is not only that it happened, it is that, in the society that produced it, it was for a significant period genuinely popular. We need to talk about one more thing before we close this section, because it bears directly on how Black Kettle and his people had ended up at Sand Creek in the first place. 6 months before the massacre, on the 16th of May, 1864, a Cheyenne chief named Lean Bear had been camping with his band on their buffalo hunting grounds near Ash Creek in Kansas. Lean Bear was a peace chief. He had traveled to Washington the previous year, along with White Antelope, and had met President Lincoln. He had received from Lincoln's own hand a silver peace medal, which he wore on his chest. He had been given an official document signed by Lincoln stating that he was peaceful and friendly with the whites. That document, on that May morning, was in his hand. The 1st Colorado Cavalry, under Lieutenant George Ear, approached Lean Bear's camp. Lean Bear, certain that this would be a peaceful encounter, rode out alone to meet them. He wore the peace medal openly on his chest. He held up the document signed by Lincoln. He rode slowly, making his intentions visible. Ear was operating under standing orders from Colonel Chivington. Those orders, entered into the military record and repeated in the later testimony of multiple witnesses, instructed Ear to kill Cheyennes wherever and whenever they were found. Ear ordered his men to fire on Lean Bear. Lean Bear was wounded. He fell from his horse. As he lay on the ground, American soldiers rode past him and continued to shoot him repeatedly in the body. The Lean Bear murder was not an obscure incident. It happened in front of Lean Bear's own band. It happened to a chief who had been publicly and officially blessed by the United States government. It was, in the judgment of many historians, one of the single most important triggers of the broader war on the plains that summer. because if the United States government would murder its own certified friends, there was no rational basis left for any Cheyenne or Arapaho leader to believe that peace was possible. And yet, and this is the part that breaks the heart, Black Kettle had kept trying. 6 months after the Lean Bear killing, with the ashes of that murder still fresh in the memory of his people, Black Kettle had gone to Camp Weld. He had walked into a room with the governor of Colorado and the colonel of the military district of Colorado and asked for peace. He had been told that if he brought his people to Fort Lyon and camped where the soldiers told him to camp, he would be safe. He had believed it. He had done exactly what he was told to do. The reason Sand Creek matters so much in American history is not only the killing, it is the deliberate, systematic betrayal of good faith. It is the fact that these were not, in any sense, the hostile Indians. They were the Cheyenne and Arapaho who had, despite every reason for cynicism, taken the United States government at its word. They were the ones who had tried, harder than anyone could reasonably have expected, to make the American system work. And they were the ones who were slaughtered. Black Kettle himself survived the massacre. That is one of the details that almost always gets lost in the retelling. He and his wife, Medicine Woman Later, who was shot 9 separate times that morning and somehow still alive at the end of the day, had escaped the initial attack. Black Kettle had carried his wife out of the camp on his back. She survived. He continued to be a peace chief after Sand Creek. He continued, even after watching his people be killed under the American flag, to seek accommodation. 4 years later, in November of 1868, Black Kettle would be at another peaceful encampment, this time on the Washita River in Indian Territory, when another dawn cavalry attack came. The commanding officer that time was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Black Kettle and Medicine Woman Later would both be killed in the opening minutes of the Battle of the Washita. They were shot off a single horse trying to escape across the river. The peace chief of the Cheyenne, the man who had survived Sand Creek and had kept trying to make peace even after that, died on a horse fleeing a cavalry charge, shot in the back by American soldiers. His body was never recovered by his own people. That was the cost of trying to make peace with the United States government in the 1860s. That was the cost of trusting the Americans. It is the story that Black Kettle's name should carry above anything else. The story of a man who, given every reason in the world to turn to war, kept trying, until the end, to find another way. And the way he tried most earnestly was the one that ended at Sand Creek. Before we leave the immediate aftermath of the massacre and move into its broader consequences, there are 2 men who deserve more than passing mention, because without them, we would know almost nothing certain about what happened at Sand Creek. Their names were Silas Soule and Edward Wynkoop, and their stories deserve to sit beside Black Kettle's in any honest telling of this history. Silas Soule was born in Maine in July of 1838. His family had been abolitionists for generations, the kind of New England Protestants who had been fighting slavery since before it was respectable to do so. And when the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened the question of whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free or slave state, the Soule family moved west to Kansas, specifically to tip the balance. Silas was a teenager. He grew into a young man in Lawrence, Kansas, in the middle of the border wars that historians now call Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery militias killed each other in the streets and the countryside. He worked as a courier and a scout for the Underground Railroad. He rode with the abolitionist guerrilla James Montgomery. He is said to have been part of a plot to spring John Brown from jail the night before Brown's execution in 1859, a plot that failed because Brown refused to leave and said he was ready to hang for his cause. Soule was, in other words, a young man who by the age of 21 had already put his life at risk multiple times for his convictions. He was not a neutral observer. He had, all his short life, understood that certain kinds of violence were wrong and that the job of a decent person was to refuse to be complicit in them. When the Civil War began, Soule enlisted with the 1st Colorado Infantry, the same outfit John Chivington helped lead. He fought at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in New Mexico in 1862, the engagement that turned back the Confederate invasion of the Southwest and in which Chivington made his military reputation. Soule was promoted through the ranks. By the fall of 1864, he was a captain commanding Company D of the 1st Colorado Cavalry at Fort Lyon. He was 26 years old. He had, at the request of his mother back in Massachusetts, recently become engaged to a young woman in Denver named Hersa Coberly. They would be married on the 1st day of April in 1865. 22 days after his wedding, he would be dead. What Soule did at Sand Creek, telling his men to hold their fire, sitting on his horse and watching the killing and refusing orders to participate, was, in the strict military sense of the word, mutiny, in time of war, in the face of the enemy, a capital offense. It was not a gesture. It was not a matter of discreet abstention. Soule kept his company in a separate formation throughout the day. He watched, and he recorded in his own memory, and a few weeks later in ink on paper, what he had seen. His letter to Edward Wynkoop, dated the 14th of December, 1864, is one of the most extraordinary documents to emerge from the 19th century American West. The language is plain. The judgment is unblinking. Soule describes, with the precision of a witness who knew he would someday be required to remember in sworn testimony what individual soldiers did to individual victims. He names names. He supplies the specific phrasing that men used while killing. He uses the word massacre early and explicitly. He writes, "I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized." That one sentence, men professing to be civilized, is the spiritual core of the case against Chivington. It is the charge that the soldiers of the 3rd Colorado were not civilized that day, whatever they were back in Denver. It is the charge that civilization is a choice, and that they chose otherwise. Soule understood exactly what he was writing. He knew, when he sent that letter, that he was committing himself to testify publicly against his own commanding officer in a military hearing that would, by the logic of the situation, require him to expose himself to grave personal danger. His testimony on March 14, 1865, before the Military Commission in Denver, was unequivocal. He described what he had seen, named officers, named dates, specified the sequence of events. He did not soften any of it. The commissioners took the testimony. It was entered into the official record. He went back to his duties. On April 23rd, 6 weeks after his testimony and 22 days after his wedding, Silas Soule was on patrol duty in Denver's downtown when he was approached by a man named Charles Squires, who had been a private in the 2nd Colorado. There was an exchange of gunfire. One contemporary account says Soule returned fire and wounded Squires. What is certain is that Squires shot Soule in the head at close range. Soule died within hours. His wife of 3 weeks was a widow. He was 26 years old. Squires fled to the New Mexico Territory. A lieutenant named James Cannon, the same Cannon who had testified about the mutilation of genitals at Sand Creek, tracked him down personally, brought him back to Denver, and lodged him in jail to face trial. Before the trial could proceed, Cannon himself died under suspicious circumstances in a Denver hotel room. His death was officially recorded as suicide. Many of his contemporaries believed it was murder. With Cannon gone, Squires escaped from the Denver jail. He was never recaptured. Nobody was ever tried for the murder of Silas Soule. Soule is buried in Riverside Cemetery in Denver. His grave, for most of a century, was unmarked and neglected. In recent decades, thanks in part to the advocacy of Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants and historians who have worked to recover this history, his grave has become a place of pilgrimage. Every year, on the anniversary of the massacre, a procession organized by the descendants of Sand Creek survivors walks from Soul's grave in Denver to the site of the massacre in Kiowa County. It is called the Sand Creek Massacre Spiritual Healing Run. It is, among other things, a pilgrimage of memory, remembering, on behalf of an entire people, the man in a blue uniform who refused to fire. Edward Wynkoop's story ended differently, but with no less moral weight. Wynkoop had been removed from Fort Lyon before the massacre precisely because he had dealt in good faith with Black Kettle. When he heard what had happened, he understood immediately, and with a clarity that would have been in some ways more painful than Soul's, that his own government had used him as a tool, that the assurances of safety he had given Black Kettle had been, in effect, the bait in a trap. He had spent weeks convincing peace chiefs that they could trust the army. He had told them, personally, that they would not be harmed. The army had then used those men's trust to kill them. Wynkoop spent much of the rest of his life trying to atone for what had been done with his unwitting help. He testified at every available opportunity. He collected and preserved the letters from Soul and Kramer. He traveled to Washington repeatedly to press for investigation. Later, working as an Indian agent for the Cheyenne and Arapaho, he tried to use his official position to protect the same people the Army had slaughtered. When the Army launched the Washita Campaign in 1868, the campaign that would kill Black Kettle, Wynkoop resigned his post in protest, stating publicly that he would not be party to the continued extermination of peaceful Indians. He lived until 1891, working variously as a soldier, a lawman, and a civil servant, and he was remembered by the Cheyenne as Tall Chief, a man they trusted. At his funeral, a delegation of Cheyenne elders came to pay respect. The reason we spend this much time on Soul and Wynkoop is not to turn Sand Creek into a story about their courage. It is the opposite. Their courage is extraordinary precisely because it was so rare. Hundreds of other men in American uniform rode into Sand Creek that morning and took part in what happened. Only about 100 refused. Of those 100, only a handful, Soul, Kramer, Connor, Wynkoop, a few others, were willing to testify publicly at serious personal cost. The massacre would have been covered up, had probably only been slightly different in character in the historical record, and would almost certainly have been remembered as a frontier battle had it not been for the specific refusal of specific men to be party to the lie. The reason we know what happened at Sand Creek is because those men decided that what they had seen could not be unseen, and that the cost of testifying was lower than the cost of silence. Soul paid for that decision with his life. The consequences of Sand Creek, in the most immediate sense, were a war. Within days of the massacre, as survivors reached the Cheyenne camps on the Smoky Hill and Republican rivers, the war pipe was lit. The Cheyenne sent messengers north to their relatives among the northern Cheyenne and the Lakota Sioux, and west to the Arapaho. The Dog Soldiers, who had been marginalized within Cheyenne politics by the peace chiefs, many of whom were now dead, became, almost overnight, the dominant force in Cheyenne military decision-making. A coalition was formed. It included Cheyenne and Arapaho bands from Black Kettle's own circle, the formerly more militant Dog Soldiers, Southern Lakota warriors, and eventually Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho allies. In January of 1865, less than 2 months after Sand Creek, a force of roughly 1,000 Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota warriors attacked the stage station and small military post at Julesburg in northeastern Colorado Territory. They overwhelmed the garrison. They burned the station. They cut the telegraph lines. In the weeks that followed, they conducted a coordinated series of raids along the South Platte River, both east and west of Julesburg, destroying ranches, cutting off the overland mail, and bringing the entire supply chain between Denver and the States, a distance of more than 500 miles of exposed road, to a standstill. In early February, they returned to Julesburg and burned it a second time. By then, the overland telegraph was down, the mail was not moving, and the white settlements of the South Platte Valley had been essentially abandoned. Settlers were fleeing east or west to the largest towns. Some were moving back to the States entirely. Then the coalition moved north, toward the Powder River country and the Black Hills. What followed was several years of the most sustained warfare between the United States and the Plains tribes in the history of the West. It produced the battle at Platte Bridge Station in July of 1865, later renamed Fort Caspar, in which a young warrior named Caspar Collins was killed, and the post was renamed in his honor. It produced Red Cloud's War of 1866 to 1868, in which the Lakota and their Cheyenne allies drove the United States Army out of the Bozeman Trail and forced the federal government to sign the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, guaranteeing the Black Hills and the Powder River country to the Lakota forever. It produced, ultimately, the Great Sioux War of 1876, the campaign that would include the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the death of George Custer, and the final destruction of the Lakota and Cheyenne resistance on the northern plains. None of this would have happened in the same way without Sand Creek. That is not hindsight. That is the sworn judgment of almost every contemporary officer and native leader who left an opinion on the record. Sand Creek was the match. The war that followed was the fire. And one of the bitter ironies that haunts the entire story is that the massacre, which was sold to the Colorado public as a way of making the plains safe for settlement, did exactly the opposite. For more than a decade after Sand Creek, the plains were more dangerous, not less. More settlers were killed, not fewer. More treaties were broken, not kept. The savings in blood that Chivington's defenders had promised never materialized. The cost in blood, paid by both native people and white settlers for years afterward, was catastrophic. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho themselves, the consequences went deeper than the war. The massacre had killed 8 members of the Cheyenne Council of 44: White Antelope, One Eye, Yellow Wolf, Big Man, Bear Man, War Bonnet, Spotted Crow, and Bear Robe. It had killed headmen of several of the Cheyenne warrior societies. It had specifically targeted, by accident of geography and timing, the leadership of the peace faction, the older chiefs who had spent their lives accommodating the whites. Their deaths permanently reshaped Cheyenne politics. The younger and more militant Dog Soldiers moved into the power vacuum. The Council of 44, already weakened by the 1849 cholera epidemic that had killed perhaps half of the southern Cheyenne population and had especially devastated the Massacota and Octaguna bands, was now hollowed out further. It never recovered its old authority. The massacre also killed, almost entirely, the band of Arapaho chief Niwot, Left Hand, whose 10 lodges at Sand Creek held perhaps 50 or 60 people. Only a handful escaped. Left Hand himself was wounded and died shortly thereafter. A small but important branch of Arapaho society was effectively wiped from existence in a single morning. In the fall of 1865, the United States government, confronted with the scale of the warfare that had followed Sand Creek and under political pressure from the Joint Committee's findings, sent a Blue Ribbon Commission to negotiate a new peace. The result was the Treaty of the Little Arkansas, signed in October of 1865. The treaty acknowledged that Sand Creek had been a massacre. It promised reparations to the surviving descendants of Sand Creek victims. It promised the Cheyenne and Arapaho free access to lands south of the Arkansas River. It was, on paper, one of the first attempts by the United States government to acknowledge wrongdoing against a native people in formal treaty language. It was abrogated by the same United States government in less than 2 years. In 1867, under the Medicine Lodge Treaty, the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation was reduced by roughly 90%. The lands promised under the Little Arkansas were stripped away, and the surviving Cheyenne and Arapaho were placed on a small and marginal tract in what is now western Oklahoma. The reparations promised to Sand Creek descendants were never fully paid. Individual claims dragged on for decades. Some were paid in trivial amounts. Many were simply denied. As late as the 20th century, Cheyenne and Arapaho families were still filing claims for losses sustained at Sand Creek. Most of those claims were either settled for pennies or not settled at all. The Medicine Lodge Treaty was itself eventually reduced by further land concessions. Each successive treaty was smaller than the last. Each successive reservation was more marginal. The pattern of promises made and then unmade, described in the terms of formal treaties and solemn ceremonies, is the pattern of the entire 19th century American Indian relationship. Sand Creek is one crystal of it. There were many others. There is no consolation in that scale. There is only the recognition that what happened at Sand Creek was not a deviation from American policy. It was, for a generation, the pattern of American policy carried to its logical conclusion. What was lost, in specific human and cultural terms, is difficult to express in statistics. The Cheyenne people, in the generations since Sand Creek, have preserved the memory carefully. Specific families trace their lineage to specific survivors. Specific spiritual practices have been maintained as a direct response to what was done on the 29th of November, 1864. The Cheyenne word for that day is kept. It is taught to children. It is part of the framework of how a Cheyenne person understands what it means to be Cheyenne in America. Now we come to the matter of remembrance and the long fight to correct the American memory of Sand Creek. For more than a century after the massacre, the official version of events in the state of Colorado remained, remarkably, the version Chivington himself had pushed in his own lifetime: that Sand Creek had been a battle against hostile Indians and that the soldiers of the 3rd Colorado had done their duty. In 1887, a small settlement along the Missouri Pacific Railroad in eastern Colorado, not far from the massacre site, was incorporated as the town of Chivington, Colorado, named after John Chivington himself. It remained officially named for him for more than a century. In 1909, 45 years after the massacre, the state of Colorado dedicated a monument on the grounds of the Colorado State Capitol in Denver, listing the engagements of Colorado troops in the Civil War. Sand Creek was listed among the battles. It shared that plaque with Glorieta Pass. The word massacre did not appear. That monument stood on the Capitol grounds, with Sand Creek listed as a battle for more than 90 years. It was not until 2002, 138 years after the killings, that the Colorado General Assembly authorized the addition of a second plaque, acknowledging that the original monument had, in the careful formal language of the addition, mischaracterized Sand Creek by calling it a battle. Even then, the first plaque was allowed to remain. The correction was added beside it. The original error was left standing, to be read alongside its own rebuke. The town of Chivington, Colorado, which had been slowly depopulated by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, was nearly a ghost town by the middle of the 20th century. In 2005, the City Council of Longmont, Colorado, after a 20-year campaign by local activists, finally changed the name of Chivington Drive in that town to Sunrise Drive. Other communities wrestled with similar symbols. A historical marker at Fort Chambers in Boulder County, the site where Company D of the 3rd Colorado had trained before the massacre, had, since its erection in 1959, described Sand Creek as a response to an Indian uprising. The marker was removed in 2023 after local researchers established that no such uprising had actually existed in the form that had been described. The city of Boulder acknowledged in its official statement removing the marker that the people killed at Sand Creek had in fact been seeking peace and had been promised protection by the United States Army when they were attacked. In 1996, the United Methodist Church, to which Chivington had belonged as a minister, issued a formal apology for the Sand Creek Massacre to the Southern Cheyenne. The statement acknowledged that Chivington had been a prominent Methodist layman and that his actions had been condemned at the time by some Methodists, defended by others, and rarely faced honestly by the institution as a whole. The 1996 apology was the first of several acts of institutional acknowledgement from the Methodist Church. In 2016, historian Gary Roberts published, under Methodist auspices, a book-length review of Methodist involvement in and response to the massacre, framed as a continuing effort at institutional truth-telling. In November of 2000, the lost letters of Silas Soule and Joseph Kramer, the ones written within 2 weeks of the massacre, resurfaced in Denver. They had been preserved, unread for generations, in the family papers of descendants of Edward Wynkoop. Their publication caused a considerable stir among historians. They were authenticated, they were studied, they confirmed in detail every major element of the eyewitness record that had already been established through congressional testimony, while adding new specifics that had not previously been documented. The letters are now held as part of the collection of History Colorado and have been reproduced and transcribed for public access. In April of 2007, after decades of work by descendants of massacre victims, by Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal governments, by historians, and by the National Park Service, the Sand Creek Massacre, National Historic Site, was officially dedicated. The dedication took place at the site itself, on the land where the killings had happened, with descendants of both the victims and, in some cases, the soldiers in attendance. The National Park Service acquired an initial 640 acres donated by the American Battlefield Trust and its partners, and has since expanded the protected area substantially. In October of 2022, an additional 3,478 acres were added to the site. A transfer announced by Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, herself a member of the Pueblo of Laguna and one of the first Native Americans to serve as Secretary of the Interior. Governor Reggie Wasana of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, speaking at the announcement, described the expansion as providing security for the protection of what he called a sacred site. In December of 2014, on the 150th anniversary of the massacre, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper formally apologized on behalf of the state of Colorado for Sand Creek. He addressed the descendants of massacre victims who had gathered in Denver for the commemoration. He said, using the kind of public language that American political figures almost never use about the historical actions of their own states, "We should not be afraid to criticize and condemn that which is inexcusable. On behalf of the state of Colorado, I want to apologize. We will not run from this history." The apology was 150 years late. It was given by a governor whose predecessor, at the time of the massacre, had been instrumental in creating the political conditions for it. It did not change the fact that the victims were long dead. It did not bring back 8 members of the Council of 44. It did not restore to the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples the land or the political structures or the peaceful tradition that Chivington's mourning had destroyed. But it mattered. It mattered because it was formal, on the record, and clearly worded. It mattered because it was delivered in the physical presence of survivors' descendants. It mattered because it said, in the name of a state that had spent most of its history defending Chivington, that Chivington had been wrong and what he had done had been inexcusable. Each year, on the weekend nearest the anniversary of the massacre, the descendants of Sand Creek victims and their supporters conduct a spiritual healing run. It begins at the grave of Silas Soule in Riverside Cemetery in Denver. It proceeds by relays of runners across the eastern plains of Colorado to the site of the massacre in Kiowa County near the small town of Eads. It covers roughly 175 miles. At the site, there are prayers. There are songs in Cheyenne and Arapaho. There are readings of the names of those killed insofar as those names can be known. There is a pause and a silence. Then, in the late afternoon, the runners gather again and turn toward home. The site itself, as it stands today, is a quiet place. It is an open plain with low bluffs to the north and west. The creek, Big Sandy Creek, the Cheyenne name for which can be rendered in English as Sandy Creek or Sand Creek, is, most of the year, a dry channel of pale sand. Short grass covers the land. There are a few interpretive markers placed by the National Park Service. There is no fence. There are no large structures. The land feels, to almost everyone who visits it, like a graveyard. It is, in the most literal sense, the ground where more than 200 people were murdered in the morning of a cold November day. The exact locations of individual killings can no longer be identified. The specific lodge where Black Kettle stood with his flag has not been located on the ground. Some researchers have argued for many years that the official National Park Service site, the land preserved under the 2007 designation, is not in exactly the correct location, that the massacre actually took place on adjacent private land where thousands of period artifacts have since been recovered. This dispute, which is ongoing, does not alter the essential fact that the massacre took place somewhere along this stretch of Big Sandy Creek, and that whatever the exact ground, the whole area is haunted ground. The Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants who visit the site regularly have made their peace, as much as anyone can, with the uncertainty. Some ceremonies are conducted on the official Park Service land. Some are conducted on the disputed ground. What matters, in the view of the elders who lead those ceremonies, is not the precise square foot. What matters is that the dead are remembered, that their names, and what was done to them, and the names of the men who did it, and the names of the men who refused to do it, are all spoken aloud, year after year, in front of the open sky. There is a harder question underneath all the acts of acknowledgement, and it is worth addressing directly before we close. The question is whether Sand Creek was an aberration in American history, or whether it was an expression of what American policy in that place and time actually was. The honest answer, on the evidence that the historical record has produced in the last half-century of serious scholarship, is that Sand Creek was not an aberration. It was, in scale and in the brazen betrayal of promises, unusually bad. But in its essential structure, a military unit attacking a peaceful native encampment that had been told it was under government protection, it was part of a pattern. The Mariposa War of 1851 in California, the attacks on Yana villages in the Sacramento Valley that same decade, the Bear River Massacre in 1863 in present-day Idaho, when Colonel Patrick Connor's California volunteers killed around 400 Shoshone men, women, and children, a death toll that is, if the scholarship is taken seriously, higher than Sand Creek's. The Bannock Campaign, the Marias Massacre of 1870 in Montana, when cavalry under Major Eugene Baker attacked a village of Piegan Blackfeet. The Camp Grant Massacre of 1871 in Arizona, in which a party of white and Mexican civilians with O'odham allies killed more than 100 Apache women and children who had surrendered and been placed under Army protection. The Washita in 1868, already mentioned, in which Black Kettle himself was killed. Wounded Knee in 1890, which closed the century in the same horror with which Sand Creek had opened its final decades. These were not isolated. They are, taken together, a pattern, and the scholarly consensus on the pattern is now firm. What made Sand Creek stand out in contemporary American consciousness was not only its horror, but its timing and its documentation. It happened while the Civil War was still ongoing and while federal politicians were looking hard at questions of justice and military conduct. It was documented by witnesses who refused to be silent at great personal cost. It was investigated, not covered up, by a Congress that was willing to condemn its own officers in language that is genuinely shocking to read even today. Because of those accidents of documentation, Sand Creek became, unusually, a case that could not be successfully mythologized into a clean frontier battle. It remained, stubbornly, a massacre. And because it remained a massacre, it has become one of the few cases that later Americans could use as a lever for asking harder questions about the pattern it was part of. This is part of why Sand Creek matters disproportionately to its actual death toll. The killings at Bear River and at the Marias were, in numerical terms, at least as bad. The betrayal at Camp Grant was structurally similar. But those events have not generated national historic sites, state apologies, annual healing runs, and museum exhibitions in the same way. Sand Creek did, because of the courage of Silas Soule and Edward Wynkoop and Joseph Kramer and the soldiers who refused to fire, because of a congressional committee that did its job, because of survivors like George Bent who left a paper trail, because of Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants who have carried the memory and demanded its honest telling for 160 years. Sand Creek has become, in American public memory, the case that will not be forgotten. And every other similar case, half-remembered or unacknowledged, is pulled closer to the surface when Sand Creek is discussed seriously. That is, among other things, the quiet work that a place like the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site does. It is not only a memorial to the specific dead, it is a standing argument against the forgetting of other, less documented atrocities in the same pattern. The descendants who come to the site know this explicitly. Tribal elders have spoken publicly over the years about their responsibility to remember Sand Creek, not only for their own ancestors, but for all the native peoples whose massacres were less well recorded. The dead at Sand Creek, in a sense, carry the dead of Bear River and of the Marias, and of all the unnamed places where American soldiers did comparable things to comparable people. That is a weight. But the elders who visit Sand Creek each year have accepted it. There is a separate and less often told part of the Sand Creek story that also deserves attention, which is the experience of the descendants of the soldiers themselves. Not all of them supported their ancestors' actions. Some, over the generations, have found themselves grappling with the fact that their great-grandfathers or great-great-grandfathers were part of the 3rd Colorado. In some cases, these descendants have reached out to Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal members. In some cases, they have attended the anniversary ceremonies. In at least one well-documented case, Michael Allen, a great-great-grandson of one of the 3rd Colorado officers, writing in the Wall Street Journal on the 150th anniversary in 2014, they have spoken publicly about the experience of having to absorb the specific violence their own ancestors committed. These are not easy encounters, but they are, more and more often, part of the texture of how Sand Creek is remembered in the early 21st century, not only as a tragedy experienced by one people, but as a history that implicates, in different ways, everyone whose great-grandparents were on the ground in 1864 Colorado on either side. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes themselves have taken, over the past 2 decades, an increasingly public and active role in the interpretation of Sand Creek. When the History Colorado Center opened its new facility in Denver in 2012 with an exhibit titled Collision: The Sand Creek Massacre, 1860s to today, the exhibit drew immediate criticism from Northern Cheyenne descendants, who felt that the exhibit had been developed without adequate consultation with the affected tribes. Within months, History Colorado closed the exhibit to the public and entered into consultations with Northern Cheyenne representatives. When it eventually reopened, it had been substantially reworked with direct tribal input. The episode became a case study in the museum profession of how institutions that want to tell difficult histories need to work with the communities most directly affected rather than simply for them. The Sand Creek Massacre Foundation, a nonprofit organization founded by descendants and supporters, now works closely with the National Park Service on the site and on educational programming. Annual gatherings at the site bring together descendants from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana, the Northern Arapaho on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. Each of those tribal communities is, in a sense, a diaspora of the people who were encamped at Big Sandy Creek in November of 1864. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge in 1867 sent some of them to what is now Oklahoma. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 routed the Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho, who had not been at Sand Creek, but were politically allied with those who were, toward separate reservations further north. Today, these three distinct tribal communities share a common history at Sand Creek and travel long distances every year to stand together on the ground. What they often say, speaking publicly on those occasions, is not what outsiders sometimes expect. They do not frame the ceremony as being about anger at the descendants of the soldiers, or about demanding more apologies from the state of Colorado, or about political grievances. They frame it as being about remembering, about telling the truth about what happened, about teaching their children the names, about honoring specific people who were killed in specific ways on that specific cold morning, and honoring the names of those few soldiers who refused to participate, and honoring the officers who testified at personal cost. It is a ceremony of truth-telling rather than accusation. It is a ceremony of carrying forward, generation by generation, the memory of a people who refused to allow their dead to be made into statistics. There is a Cheyenne saying, passed down through oral tradition, that the dead are not truly dead as long as someone speaks their names. By that standard, the dead of Sand Creek have not died. Their names, where they can be recovered, are spoken every November. The names of the chiefs killed: White Antelope, One Eye, Yellow Wolf, Big Man, Bear Man, War Bonnet, Spotted Crow, Bear Robe, Left Hand, are invoked aloud in ceremony. The names of unnamed women and children are honored as unnamed. The fact of their killing is not minimized, and neither is the fact of their humanity. They were not warriors meeting warriors in a battle. They were mothers and grandmothers and newborns in a village that had trusted a promise. That is what is remembered, and that memory, at this point, is well into its 7th generation. It is not going away. The archaeological work at Sand Creek, which began in earnest in the 1990s and has continued ever since, has recovered more than 4,000 artifacts from the area around the massacre site. These are, overwhelmingly, objects associated with the attack itself: bullets, cartridge cases, pieces of military equipment, fragments of the cannon shells fired by the howitzers, buttons and tin cups, and pieces of harness. A smaller number of objects are associated with the Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment itself: beads, knife fragments, scraps of metal cookware, pieces of iron points that had been traded from white suppliers in the preceding decades. Each of these objects has been mapped, catalogued, and considered as physical evidence. Some of them have been entered into the formal record of the National Park Service. Others have gone into museum collections or into tribal custody. Taken together, they constitute the most complete physical record of any 19th century Indian Wars engagement on the North American plains, and they have made it possible to reconstruct, in a way that would not otherwise be possible, the specific sequence of events on the ground. What the archaeology tells us, interestingly, is that the specific location of the main encampment has remained a matter of dispute between the National Park Service and private researchers. The Bowen family, whose land lies adjacent to the official historic site, has argued for years that the actual village stood not where the Park Service marks it, but approximately 2 miles further up the creek, on their property. Thousands of the recovered artifacts have been found on Bowen land. This dispute, which has generated its own scholarship and its own published books, does not alter any of the essential facts of what happened. The massacre took place somewhere along this stretch of Big Sandy Creek. The general geography is known. The specific boundary between killing ground and village ground remains, in the judgment of some researchers, unresolved. The soldiers of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, after mustering out at the end of December 1864, returned to civilian life in Colorado Territory. Most of them left no significant historical trace beyond their names on the regimental rolls and, in some cases, their testimony before the Military Commission and the Congressional Committee. A small number became locally prominent in various ways, as ranchers, as saloon keepers, as freight haulers, as minor politicians. Some were remembered in their communities for the rest of their lives as heroes of Sand Creek. Others, quieter, kept the fact of their service out of polite conversation. Colonel George Shoup, the field commander of the 3rd Colorado, Chivington held district command, but Shoup had day-to-day command of the regiment itself, went on to a substantial political career. He was elected territorial governor of Idaho, then served as Idaho's first state governor when it was admitted to the Union in 1890, then served as a United States senator from Idaho until 1901. A statue of Shoup stands in the National Statuary Hall collection in the United States Capitol, representing the state of Idaho. It was placed there in 1910. It remains there today. The plaque beneath it does not mention Sand Creek. Governor John Evans of Colorado Territory, who had issued the proclamation in June of 1864 that set the conditions for the massacre, was asked by the federal government to resign following the publication of the Joint Committee's findings. He did so in August of 1865. He remained an influential figure in Colorado life, served on the board of what became the University of Denver, and is the namesake of Mount Evans in the Rocky Mountains, one of the most prominent and accessible 14,000-foot peaks in the state, visible from Denver on clear days. The name was a source of ongoing controversy for decades, and in 2023, after sustained advocacy by Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants and by Colorado state officials, Mount Evans was officially renamed Mount Blue Sky, in honor of the traditional spiritual practices of the two peoples who had been encamped at Sand Creek when Evans's volunteers attacked. George Bent, the half-Cheyenne, half-white survivor whose letters to the historian George Hyde preserved so much of the native perspective on the massacre, lived until 1918. He was 74 years old at his death. He spent his later decades moving between the Cheyenne and white worlds, working as an interpreter, as an informant for anthropologists, as a go-between in negotiations, and, most importantly, as a correspondent who wrote, over thousands of pages of letters, what he remembered and what the old people he had known remembered. The Hyde manuscript, Life of George Bent, written from his letters, published in 1968 long after both men's deaths, is, along with the Soule and Kramer letters, the single most important narrative source for what happened in Black Kettle's village that morning. Bent was at Sand Creek. He was wounded there. He dug into the sand under the creek bank with his hands and survived. He spent the rest of his life telling what he had seen, and because he did, the Cheyenne voice at Sand Creek did not die with the dead. Edward Wynkoop died in 1891 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at the age of 55. His funeral, in a detail that says a great deal, was attended by a formal Cheyenne delegation that had traveled several days to be there. The delegation was received with full honors. The Cheyenne elders spoke at the service in their own language. What they said, in the accounts of white witnesses present, was that Wynkoop had been the soldier who kept his word, the tall chief whose name the Cheyenne had learned to associate with truth. In the broader history of Indian-white relations in the 19th century, it is not a common thing for a delegation of native elders to travel to the funeral of a former United States Army officer in order to testify publicly to his honor. That it happened for Wynkoop is part of his legacy. And finally, there is the matter of what the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples themselves have made of Sand Creek in the cultural sense, over 7 generations. The event is remembered in oral history, in ceremony, in songs, and in the specific personal stories that families pass down. Children in Cheyenne communities today are taught about Sand Creek not as a distant historical event, but as part of their own family story. Specific descendants can trace their lineage to specific survivors. Specific ceremonies have been developed or adapted in response to the massacre and to the ongoing work of healing its generational wounds. The Cheyenne and Arapaho relationship to the site at Big Sandy Creek is not only commemorative, it is active. It is part of the current spiritual life of living communities. This, more than anything, is what survives. Not a monument, though there is a monument now, finally. Not a plaque, though there are plaques now, finally. Not even an apology from a governor, though there is an apology now, finally. What survives is a living people who have refused, through 160 years of pressure, to forget. What survives is the fact that the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations are still nations. What survives is the continuing insistence, renewed every November by the descendants who come to the site, that what happened there matters, and that the dead are not yet finished being honored. That is not consolation. There is no consolation for what was done at Sand Creek. But it is something. It is the refusal of the people Chivington tried to erase to be erased. And it is, across generations, the final answer that history has given to the man who said he stood by Sand Creek. It is worth sitting with, at the end, what Sand Creek actually cost. Not the abstract cost, but the specific one. It cost the lives of approximately 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people. The exact number will never be known with precision. Historians have argued over the figure for a century and a half, with estimates ranging from roughly 70 to as many as 600. The National Park Service, on its official interpretive materials at the site, uses the number 230. That number is the one carved, in effect, into the public memory of the event. Whatever the precise count, the composition of the dead is not in dispute. Approximately 2/3 of them were women, children, and the elderly. The active warriors in the camp numbered fewer than 75, and most of those were older men or boys still growing into their strength. It cost the lives of 8 members of the Cheyenne Council of 44, the peace chiefs, the consensus builders, the older men whose entire social function had been to keep their people from war. Their loss shifted Cheyenne politics permanently away from accommodation and toward resistance. It cost the lives of virtually the entire Arapaho band of Chief Niwot, Left Hand, a small group of around 60 people whose deaths at Sand Creek effectively extinguished a distinct branch of Arapaho society that had existed for generations before. It cost the life of Silas Soule, assassinated in a Denver street 5 months after the massacre at the age of 26, less than a month into his marriage, because he had refused to participate in the killing and had then, at grave personal risk, told the truth about it under oath. It cost Edward Wynkoop the arc of his intended military career. It cost Joseph Kramer, who, like Soule, had refused orders, the rest of his life as a man who had seen things he could not unsee. The Soule and Kramer letters, when they resurfaced in 2000, read as the work of young men who understood they were witnessing something that would shape the rest of their days, and in Soule's case, the brief remainder of his life. It cost Black Kettle 4 more years of what remained to him. The peace chief who had flown the American flag over his lodge at Sand Creek, who had survived that morning by carrying his wounded wife out on his back, who had continued to argue for accommodation even after all of it, would be shot off a horse with that same wife by American cavalry at the Washita in November of 1868. His body was not recovered by his people. The American flag he had trusted flew over the men who killed him. It cost the United States government its claim, in the years that followed, to be dealing in good faith with the Plains tribes. The war that erupted in January of 1865 with the first attack on Julesburg did not fully end until the surrender of the last Lakota and Northern Cheyenne resistance after the Battle of the Little Bighorn in the late 1870s. More than a decade of sustained warfare, thousands of deaths on both sides, dozens of broken treaties, and the final destruction of the free-roaming Plains cultures. All of this is traceable as a direct causal consequence to the 8 hours at Sand Creek on November 29, 1864, and to the message those 8 hours sent to every Native nation watching, that the word of the United States government was worth nothing. And it cost, in a way that is harder to quantify but no less real, something in the moral record of a country still in the process of deciding what it was. The Civil War was being fought, in 1864, over the proposition that all men were created equal. Soldiers in Union uniform were dying at that very moment on battlefields in Virginia and Tennessee for the cause of ending chattel slavery. That same month, the same month as Sand Creek, Sherman was marching across Georgia. The United States was, by the judgment of its own political leadership, engaged in a great moral struggle to rededicate itself to the principle of human equality. And in the middle of that struggle, a volunteer regiment in federal service, commanded by a Methodist minister who had once risked his own safety as an outspoken abolitionist, rode into a sleeping village of people who had been promised protection by that same United States government and spent 8 hours killing women and children and mutilating corpses for trophies. What happened at Sand Creek did not contradict the broader moral project of the Civil War era. It was, in a way that Americans have found it difficult to face honestly, part of that era's contradiction. The same country that ended slavery in 1865 opened the new year with the first reports from Sand Creek still circulating. The same Congress that passed the 13th Amendment convened the Joint Committee that condemned Chivington. The same federal government that enforced Reconstruction in the South was, at the same moment, engineering treaty betrayals on the Plains. That contradiction is one that has shaped the country ever since, and it has not yet been fully resolved. What survives today in the physical world is remarkably little. The village at Sand Creek was burned by Chivington's men. What few items of material culture remained in the area after the looting were recovered in later decades by archaeologists and private collectors. Many of those items are now held in museum collections. Some are held by the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes themselves. Human remains taken from the site as trophies, including remains displayed in Denver theaters and saloons in the months after the massacre, have been, in a decades-long process of repatriation that is still ongoing, returned to tribal custody. 18 identified victims were reburied in the 1990s at Concho, Oklahoma, in a circular formation representing a tipi. Other remains have been returned more recently. Some are still held, or were until very recently, in institutional collections. The work of recovery is not complete. What survives in human terms is more substantial. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Northern Cheyenne tribe, and the Northern Arapaho tribe are all living, functioning, sovereign nations today. They have their own governments, their own schools, their own languages, their own ceremonies. The line from the 750 people encamped at Big Sandy Creek in 1864 to the tribal members who gather at the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site each November is unbroken. The people Chivington set out to destroy are still here. They are having children. They are raising those children in the full knowledge of what was done to their ancestors and of who refused to do it. They have made the work of remembrance into one of the central cultural acts of their communities. That is not a consolation for what was lost. It is, however, a kind of continuing answer to what was attempted. There is one last thing worth saying. It is something that the elders who speak at Sand Creek every November usually find a way to say, though not always in the same words. It is this: the point of telling this story is not to generate guilt in people who were not present. It is not to assign collective responsibility to anyone living today for the specific actions of specific men in 1864. It is, instead, to keep alive the knowledge of what certain human beings are capable of doing to other human beings when a chain of permissions and deceptions and political pressures and dehumanizing language is allowed to build up without check. That chain was fully assembled in Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1864. It had been built by newspapers, by politicians, by military orders, by sermons, by saloon conversations, by the simple daily fact of a society that had come to see one category of human beings as outside the protection of ordinary decency. When the chain was complete, it pulled the trigger almost by itself. Chivington gave the order. 600 men obeyed it. 100 men refused. The difference between those two groups was not the difference between good people and bad people. It was the difference between men who had, in some inner chamber, they perhaps did not fully understand themselves, decided that certain things could not be done in their presence, and men who had not. That is the lesson the descendants offer year after year at Sand Creek. Not a lesson about the 19th century, a lesson about what every generation has to decide in its own time when the chain of permissions begins to build up again. If this story moved you, consider leaving a like so that others can find it. And if you have the time, leave the name of one of the people we mentioned today in the comments. Their names deserve to be said aloud. Thank you for spending this time with Western Pioneer Archives.